So the next film we're going to review is The County. So Elle, why don't you tell us a little bit about this film?
So The County is by Icelandic filmmaker Grímur Hákonarson, whose last film was Rams, which was debuted at the Cannes Centre Regard in 2015. And The County follows similar lines of it's based on Icelandic sheep farming. And this film in particular looks at Inga, who has her and her husband have a farm out in Iceland, and they trade solely under a co-op. Now, the idea of a co-op system in Iceland was kind of developed out of kind of protest against the big corporations and kind of big brands in Reykjavik in centre. So this tiny village, they all kind of trade within this co-op system. However, it's very corrupt, it's very capitalist because of the leaders in charge. It's a bit of a spoiler, but it starts at the very beginning of the film. Is after the death of her husband, which is under quite mysterious circumstances. Inga, as an underdog character, kind of fights up against this co-op, and in her kind of protest tries to rope in other farmers, to kind of, so that it's a celebration of kind of bringing together kind of the farming community, celebrating local produce, and it's a really great discussion about Icelandic culture in the modern day and how that works, for a lot of not filmmakers, farmers out in the kind of very rural kind of Icelandic wilderness. And it was premiered at TIFF in 2019. So yeah, I was a big fan of this. I'm always here for Scandinavian kind of social realism. It brings about some fantastic discussions, and Inga, who's played by Arnis Thron Elgaristo, kind of really fantastic actress. Kind of there's a lot of potential with her, and it's a very kind of feminist film that looks at her vulnerabilities kind of around the death of her husband and kind of going up with this kind of very male dominated corporation. So it's very kind of protest and kind of sentimental at the same time. And yeah, keen to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, this certainly, I think there's always one film or show that really stands out in our week, and this one that was that for me. And I particularly, I think last time we discussed Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, and there was something about the way that there was less dialogue than you would expect, or less drama in it, um, but but because it was concise, you could really feel the emotions of these actors, and that particularly with the main character of this film, um I think happened, and I really felt for her story and her plight, and sometimes her willingness to, to spray milk on on the co-op. That was one of my favorite parts. But yeah, it was a really great film. It was beautiful. It was really well acted, and and dealt with serious issues. So highly loved it. Jim?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think it it's a bit. This is the thing that I seem to keep coming back to, right? When we talk about these films on the show, and it's the same with Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always on the last show, and various other ones. The best films, particularly these ones which are telling small personal stories, it's just a well told story. I mean, and like the acting is excellent, and it really brings you into the character of Inga and kind of like the emotions that she's going through. And part of that is the performance, obviously, but the rest of it is the actual direction of the actors themselves. And there's loads of little touches here, much like, as I say, the film we spoke about on the last show, where you just get that sense of what is happening. And one bit that really stood out to me, is such a little thing, is Inga's talking to her children about the father's death, and it's just this lovely moment where she tells them something about it, and they just kind of like, they cover their mouth kind of in shock, but they both do it in unison. It's like, it's just, and it's these wonderful little moments that make it so well pitched and so well realized in terms of the characters and the story that they are inhabiting. On top of that, there is also kind of like certain unique slants to it, in the sense that this sort of story, this the the David versus Goliath thing, right, comes up quite a lot. And, you know, I mean, if you were to think about kind of, you know, a woman going up against corporate entities, and the one that everybody goes to in their head, of course, is Erin Brockovich and things like that. But I think that story's popped up a few times. But what's quite interesting about this one is it also brings a little bit of that kind of, you know, Scandinavia. I mean, I realize it's Iceland, so we're probably stretching the definition of Scandinavia at this point, but that kind of like that Nordic kind of like slightly bleak tone, but yet there's just this element of like weird humor to it. And I think like the milk spraying scene that Amanda mentioned, that's something that would, to me, fit in alongside that. So that's where, in contrast to, let's say, Judy and Punch, which I think I think generally we seem to be sort of like reasonably on board with. But this is a good example of when it balances that tone really extremely well. I think this film goes between, like, I don't want to say corporate, but kind of like business intrigue, personal drama, some slight kind of like dark humor as well, and it weaves between them very, very naturally, just as the characters themselves do. You know, they can go from despair to determination, and it all feels very natural and works very well. And I think a lot of that comes down to the way the film is shot, in terms of it's got that quite naturalistic feel to it, but also it knows when to make it more tense. And it reminded me of The Insider at one point. There's this scene where kind of like, you know, some co-op goons try to basically intimidate Inga, and it reminded me of a lot of films that I like, but also it brings its own unique tone and style to the table. And I think this is one where I think it's executed well, and it's just a very well told story.
It's interesting because I saw another film last year that was Icelandic called Woman at War, that was also about a woman sort of taking on the environmental issues and taking on the system and being, you know, ostracized in Iceland. So when I first saw this, I was like, wow, there's a lot of Icelandic films about the, you know, one woman against the country. But I thought this one was way better, again, in this tone that was sort of heartfelt and, you know, and social realism, like you mentioned, and I enjoyed that than the quirkiness of Women at War, even though Women at War was fun and, you know, it was a totally different take. But it was interesting to see they both kind of came out around the same time.
Yeah, because I saw Women at War, and it kind of I think it leans on the comedic aspects more. But I think that I agree with you in that this is better. It's got a slightly different tone, but it balances those aspects better than I think Women at War did. You know, but it's a very apt comparison. They are very similar in that regard.
It's a great demonstration as well of what can just be a good story on a very simple premise. It's about farmers and farming in Iceland. It's a very normal life story. It's looking at people's kind of work habits. You see her like mucking out on the farms to, yeah, very amusingly flinging cow dung at people who doesn't quite agree with. And it has got a really funny tone to it, but it's really kind of just subtle. It's that sort of kind of sarcastic nature to it, to kind of really fed up with just the way things are going, but a real kind of foolhardy, like going out and actually doing something. And the fact that they kind of bring in social media to like a very rural community, and how she kind of takes to Facebook for her protests, and is like, she does that very kind of great hesitant moment of, oh, do I send that, do I not? But it's not in a kind of a cheesy way. It's very like, all right, I'm going to do this, see what happens, and then deals with all the consequences in a very mature way. But also it's really subtly kind of, it's very, even not subtly, it's very profoundly brave in the terms of, to get this equality for all the other farmers, it means risking her own livelihoods, and whilst also managing, yeah, with her children, with her grieving, keeping the farm running. It shows this great multitasking of women in it as well, and I think it's just a great subject matter, and it's highly relatable. And you see Icelandic films are becoming much more popular with an international audience because of the way they tell really great relevant stories to a lot of people and a lot of emotions you can identify with. But that's really interesting as well, and you're like, okay, that was a really good film, and that's what I think a lot of people are looking forward to. Just, they don't want it to, yeah, there's so many films that are very hard-hitting, very super emotional, or very showy and very shiny, and this is just a really great story that's funny yet sincere, and and it just, I just really enjoy it, and I think that Grimmer tells it brilliantly. And also getting Valgeir Sverrisson, who's a really famous Icelandic composer, which makes the score beautiful as well. I mean, Iceland is this sweeping great expanse, and kind of getting to highlight the rural villages through this like a beautiful melodic composition is just, it brings it together really nicely. It's a big fan.
Yeah, there's as I say, it's just there's some good visual attention to detail as well. I mean, like, I'm sure you could talk about the way it kind of like frames the landscape when she's out looking at things, and just the way it deals with kind of like confrontations between the characters. But even just I think back to the start of the film where it goes to great lengths in kind of establishing shots to put an emphasis on the sort of the mechanized milking system for the cows, right? And it's only when you get later into the film that that actually starts to play a part in the plot, and you realize that actually that was very good, kind of like like Chekhov's milking machine, basically, right? It was doing that. It was doing this setup very well. So it's a very well told story. It's got good acting. I like the things it's trying to communicate, and the issues that kind of like form the foundation, if you like. But it's just a very well executed film, and I think it balances all its different elements really pretty well.
And when does that come out, Jim? Do you know, or is it already out on video on demand?
It's going to be out on May 22nd on Curzon Home Cinema.
Okay, May 22nd.